Hey guys, I want to shoot a video here to follow up on the Gen 6 454 for the Silverton and Marco Island. Got the rest of the top end on it and got the throttle body cleaned up and even cleaned thoroughly on the inside. I got a new gasket right here. This gasket, this front body had not been removed. This gasket looked really good, but it's weird. This nut was catching right here, so I filed that down a little bit. As far as the throttle body internally, it's super clean. I got it nice and clean, so it should flow really well. Oh yeah, very important. These valve cover gaskets, and I know the owner's going to know it. It's weird. Somebody put them on. They used a heavy-duty flathead screw, which is okay. It's holding fairly well, but it's not the traditional. See that that nut. The whole idea about the Gen 6, that nut has a shoulder where the shaft is, and what it does, it aligns everything. These do not. So you had to pay really close attention to getting the valve cover gaskets perfectly lined up with everything. Now, just to be safe, what I did right here, because this is there's a bolt, a rocker cover bolt right here. What I did was I took this one out of this side engine, and I stuck the flathead bolt in here because why? It's accessible to replace later on. This is not accessible, and this throttle body can be left in, but I strongly suggest that these be removed and they have the proper Gen 6 rocker cover bolts put in. That because there's a possibility when these things heat up they could move around a little bit, and there's no shoulder in there to keep these from moving, so those need to be replaced. These on the other side, I won't go into great detail. They're all flathead, as you can see, but they're completely accessible. Had a lot of problems with the threads on the exhaust manifolds, the studs and stuff. Everything's good. It's all back together and it's nice and tight, but I think these Chinese bolts and nuts are basically designed for like a one-time use because the threads were really screwed up. Again, everything torqued up well to 28 foot-pounds. I would have preferred to go to 30, but it just didn't feel good, so I stopped at 28. And now I could have gone to 30 and it probably would have been okay, but I didn't want to risk doing any stripping on the fine threads. They're all in, all's well. They don't need to be changed. Don't worry about them. They torqued up fine. There's not going to be any leakage. Again, there's no water flowing around down there anyway. You could crank this engine up and loosen all the exhaust valves. I'm sorry, all of the exhaust bolts up, and water's not going to go anywhere. It's not going to hurt the engine. So anyway, I just brought it up to mention it's a time factor. It kicked my ass time-wise. I lost a lot of time with that. Not complaining, just discussing. All's well there. It was weird when I was priming the oil system. I always tap into like that's the oil pressure alarm right there. I tapped into that with my oil pressure gauge, and I wasn't really happy with the oil pressure reading I was getting from my priming tool. Typically I get about I don't know, about 40 to 50 foot-pounds, or give or take, and I was getting a really erratic 36 to 40 foot-pounds. It's probably okay, nothing to really worry about, but it did spook me a little bit. And also I got to spending more time in thought from a diagnostic standpoint of why the hell was the oil creamy and mocha. Again, I mentioned in an early video that I believe the client thought that it just briefly got in recently, but I got a strong suspicion that this engine probably ran that way for a little while. So on that note, where does that come from? Either the coolant leaking into the system via head gaskets, or typically people don't know how to properly torque these intake gaskets and they end up leaking right there due to warpage. And then you've got the this is the oil cooler. So cool water, I'm going to try to balance here, And also the sun's going down, so the light, I'm dealing with the time factor with the sun and the good lighting. But this is where the cool water comes in from the ocean and then runs through this cooler and then up to the heat exchanger, and then this goes into the heat exchanger and goes through the system. Where I'm going this is there's there's an oil, that's the remote oil filter system down there. This is the oil line that taps into, I'm just moving that out of the way. That oil line comes over the top. I'm sorry, I try to get my hand in there. Comes over the top, comes in and taps in right there. And then there's an oil line down there that taps into the bottom. So the oil comes out of the engine and flows through the cooler and around the water and all that jazz. And where I'm going this is I got spooked. I went ahead and I disassembled every bit of that, and I did a pressure test on the oil cooler, because I got to thinking, I thought, man, that sure is suspect that the oil cooler may be bad, and raw water from the ocean is mixing into the oil, you know, that's flowing through this thing through little rods, just like a radiator, and or a typical heat exchanger on any marine system. And it was not. It pressure tested super, zero problems at all. So it's a good insurance policy to know that it's good. On that note, that leads me back to the only thing I can figure is it was a piss poor build the last time, and these somewhere in here it was leaking, and maybe it was not enough to really read on the dipstick, because it's deceptive. You'll pull the dipstick and you look at the oil, and it's like, oh man, the oil looks great. Yeah, well, you wipe it across a white cloth and look at it, and if it's any sort of tan or brown or chocolate, there's water getting into the system. If it's, you know, as I talked to a guy at the marina the other day, I prefer to pull the dipstick and see the oil is kind of black and burned, because that lets me know that there's no water or no moisture getting in there at all. So I'm going to try to keep this video under 8 or 10 minutes. I'm literally, I know I always say I'm going to shut it down right here, and I keep running my mouth, but it takes like 25 minutes to upload a video that lasts over 10 or 12 minutes. So on that note, from a time standpoint, you know, I lost my ass today, but there was a lot of stuff that had to be done to assure that we didn't just assemble, like I was talking about last night, just go into assembly mode and just not really care anymore. That's not what I meant by that, and I shouldn't have made that statement, because when you get to a situation where you need to assess something, you need to slow down, back up, think, and go from there, because it'd be a shame to bolt all this stuff together, crank this baby up and run it, having never checked the oil cooler, and then all of a sudden salt water starts washing into the oil system again and just devastates everything that you just did. So that would have been a real shame. So I don't fear that. I'm really hoping and praying it was just a piss poor build somewhere down the line, because again, this baby has been bored all the way up to 60 thousandths, and usually there's, you know, that's, to me, that's the end of the engine. That I wouldn't build this block again if there were problems with it. This block was stock. It was standard dimensions, even though it was weird. If you look at some of the early videos, the pistons were labeled all sorts of odd. It was really oddball, but it runs great. So just goes to show you. Anyway, the engine's turning over really much smoother. I have to say this to the client, because on the front end, when I was doing the diagnosis, I wasn't very happy with the way the engine felt as I was turning it over. It just didn't feel like a really quality build. It had some spots in it that felt a little bit sticky and whatnot, but after I got all the flush out and turned it over with my torque wrench, it takes about 32 foot-pounds to turn it over, and that's excellent. That because you're having to push through all the springs on the rockers and the valves and such and whatnot. So that's a good reading. It's turning over torque wrench wise really smooth, or really well. It's still got some, it's just not a real smooth, precise engine. And what does that mean? There could be some bearing issues in there. We may need to experiment with different grades of oil and solution and whatnot to protect the engine. But I think I don't mean to instill any fear or anything, but I think it was worth the time that we've. I say I think. I'm confident that it was worth the time that we've spent to get it to this point. But I don't know if this thing's going to last 2,000 hours, 3,000 hours. I don't really see it happening. It's probably going to be a safe engine and run really good, but it's going to be a special engine that's going to need a lot of oversight and just real cautious watchfulness over the next 5 to 10 hours of running it and such. So anyway, I've got to shut the video down there. It's talked a little bit too long, but I think it was good to cover some of those rotational things, and I'm just going to stop talking right there. So anyway, thanks guys, I appreciate you looking.